Evening, everybody. Good to see you all. Do have a new map handout for you tonight. It has a map on the front and the back. They're just different maps of the same thing. So the maps we've been looking at with Paul's travels are zoomed in a little bit more than these are. These zoom out and show us the wider Mediterranean world, the Roman world in the first century, which we need to have for what we're discussing tonight. So you can pick which one of those two you like better to look at as we work our way through this. Let's pray and we'll get started. Our Father, we ask your blessings on us as we assemble around your word. We thank you that we have this opportunity and these good brothers and sisters, Christian friends to share this time with. Pray your blessing on each individual and those unique things that they need. Thank you for being so good to us and taking care of us every day. Help us to be good to one another and to others and to share your grace. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, we finished going through Acts last week. Now, you remember at the end of Acts chapter 28, verse 31, Paul is in prison in Rome. That's the last thing Luke tells us. So the question arises, what happened to Paul? Luke doesn't inform us. It wasn't his purpose. And so I thought we'd try and discover what we can from the evidence we have in the New Testament about what happened after Acts 28:31. What happened to Paul? We do know some things pretty well, and then some other things come from early Christian writers and tradition, and I'll try and point out the difference as we go. But a lot of detail here. And so I composed it in a document that I call The Last Writings and Works of Paul. And so everything I'm going to share with you is in this, including some stuff I won't go through with you. Look at several verses, but there's more verses in this document. What I'm saying is, if you would want a copy of this document, you're welcome to it. You just need to let me know, and I'll make a copy and get it to you. So I'm going to pass around a little sign-up sheet. If you want the fuller extent of what we're going through, just put your name there, and I'll get it to you when I can. But again, we're looking at what happens after Acts 28 to Paul. And we begin with, keep in mind, two different groups of Paul's letters that we talked about before, but is helpful to us in this question of what happened to Paul later. So the prison letters, the 4 prison letters that Paul wrote while he was in this first Roman imprisonment that Luke ends the book of Acts with. He writes 4 letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And we'll read a couple of verses from there here in a bit, but he wrote and mailed those while he was in the Roman imprisonment, the first one, Acts 28. And another good thing about going through this, by the way, is we're going to read a bunch of verses we normally don't read, that we normally ignore, because they're at the end of these books and they're full of names that we don't know. Well, it actually becomes important when you ask questions like, what happened? So we'll look at those in a minute. Then the other group of the letters is the pastoral letters. That's what scholars call them. God didn't call them that. But the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, which Paul wrote after he was released from the first imprisonment. Sometime after that. Okay? And the actual chronological order would be 1 Timothy, then Titus, then 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy is the last thing Paul wrote. But he wrote these after his release from the first Roman imprisonment, during that period of time when he's free, and then he writes 2 Timothy after he's been re-imprisoned in Rome. And you can tell that by what he writes in 2 Timothy. Okay? So keep in mind those two things. So from all these letters that we've mentioned, along with some of the earliest Christian writers, now when I say that, I mean outside of the New Testament, okay? People that lived in the 1st century and the 2nd century AD, who wrote and talked about people that they knew, like Paul, okay? We have some information from them. And then pretty strong Christian traditions, and that's getting into the 3rd and 4th century AD. There's a historian named Eusebius that wrote a history of early Christianity. From people like them, we gather some information along these lines. The later you get, the less reliable it is, of course, because the intervenance of time and so forth. But to start, we think that in about 63 AD, 63, Paul is released from the first Roman imprisonment, probably due to the fact that when the time for the trial came, his accusers didn't come from Jerusalem. They didn't bother to go. Paul is sort of out of sight, out of mind. Remember, he's been there for 2 years in prison. And we think probably that they never showed up. And so when that happens, he's acquitted. Either that or they showed up and he won the trial and was acquitted. For some reason, he is released from that first Roman imprisonment. And he actually alludes to the release in his writings in the prison letters. So if you go to Philippians, for example, let's look at a couple of verses in Philippians, and we want to look at one in Philemon. But he's anticipating being released, clearly, as he writes these letters from prison. Philippians chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. He speaks of Timothy in verse 22. He says, "But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me." You see, he's anticipating this coming trial. "And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also." He's writing to Philippi saying, sending Timothy, and I hope to come soon as I figure out how this is going to work out, and I really think I'm gonna, shortly. So he's anticipating the trial and that it's going to have a good result. Does that make sense? If you go over then to Philemon, that little book right after Titus, little one-chapter book, Philemon, verse 22. He's writing to this man, Philemon. Philemon lives in Colossae. Okay, so you think in your map where Philippi was, up in North Greece, then Colossae is over in the country out from Ephesus in Asia Minor. This letter's going to Colossae, to Philemon, and he says in verse 22, to Philemon, "At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I am hoping that through your prayers I will be graciously given to you." So Paul is in prison in Rome, and he says, "Get a room ready for me, I'm coming. I hope. If you're still praying for me, I think I'm coming." So he's anticipating being released, which, pretty good evidence of what eventually happens. So we think in about 63 AD, he's released. And if he did what he said he intended to do when he was released, in these prison letters, he went to Philippi. Remember, he said that to the Philippians, I'm coming to see you when I get out. And so he went to Philippi, and do you remember where Philippi is in the travels? You have to go up in the northern part of Greece. He went there on the second and third missionary journeys. If you find, for instance, this one that says the ancient world, find Macedonia, you'll see Philippi just in smaller letters just above it. So we think that upon his release, he went to Philippi once again, and then that he went from there over to Asia Minor, because he had said to Philemon, who lived in Colossae in Asia Minor, get a room ready for me. So that he went and revisited these churches in the area of Asia Minor. How long did that take? We don't know. But apparently that was part of his plan. Now, there are a lot of people, both ancient writers from our perspective and modern scholars and modern non-scholars who believe that Paul also during this time went to Spain. Remember, do you remember him ever saying anything about wanting to go to Spain? Yes. When he wrote to the Romans chapter 15, verse 22, he said, I hope to visit you in passing as I go to Spain. So for a long time he had wanted to go to Spain, and a lot of people think he did. Now we don't have concrete 100% evidence that he did. And I'm sort of torn whether he did or not, because if he did, man, he crammed a lot of travel into 5 years in that ancient world. So it seems like it makes the time frame really tight between 63 when he's released and 68 when we think he dies. But a lot of people think he did, including some ancient writers. There was a Roman Christian named Clement, C-L-E-M-E-N-T, who wrote a couple of letters that we have. And in the first letter of Clement, he says, Paul reached the farthest extent of the West, which would have been Spain in those days. Not in our days, but in their Spain would have been the farthest you could go west before what we know as the Atlantic, right? So he thought it was, and Clement is right there at the end of the first century and into the second century. So pretty early on, people thought Paul went, but we just don't know for sure if he did. He certainly wanted to. He wanted to take the gospel to Spain. Be fascinating to know more about that, wouldn't it? The gospel eventually got to that country, but we don't know if Paul's the one who was able to take it there. So, other places that we know pretty definitively that Paul went during this release period was Ephesus. He went to Ephesus, most certainly, because he says he did. Because at one point he says he left Timothy at Ephesus. You go over to 1 Timothy for a second. 1 Timothy. Remember, this is one of the what kind of letters? One of the pastorals. 1 Timothy. So these are written after he's released from the first imprisonment that we know about. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. Now, here's one of my silly questions I ask about every week. Who is 1 Timothy written to? Timothy, right? Okay. Amazing how complex this is. Timothy is written to Timothy. So, Paul writes, 1 Timothy 1 verse 3, "As I urged you, Timothy, when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine." So he left Timothy in Ephesus to work with the church while he was going to Macedonia, northern Greece. That's a place like where Philippi is. That make sense? Okay. Also, chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, verse 14. Again, he's writing to Timothy. He says, "I hope to come to you soon." Now, where is Timothy? He's in Ephesus. Paul left him there. He sent him there. Specifically, go work with that church. "I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." So he's intending to go to Ephesus. He sent Timothy ahead there, and we think that he did eventually get there. Most scholars believe that 1 Timothy was written in about 65 AD. So he's released from Roman imprisonment 63. A couple years later, he writes this letter, first letter to Timothy, about 65. He's traveled for a couple of years in these different places. The next link is, yes?
Question. When he is writing to Philemon, is it true that he had never been to Colossae?
We don't have a record of him being there, because remember, Ephesus is the big city in the area, and he instructs them to take the gospel out in these countryside cities, which would include places like Colossae. We don't have a mention of him going there, other than it seems like he probably did after he got out of this Roman imprisonment. Yeah. But the first time, no. That was probably other people that planted the church there. All right? Feel free to interrupt me as I go. Probably make the class more interesting. Titus chapter 1. Titus chapter 1. Another silly question. Who did Paul write Titus to? Come on, everybody at once. Yes. A for the day. Do you remember where Titus worked? The island of Crete. So we know Paul's been there before, but Titus 1 verse 5, again, this is one of the letters written after he's released from prison. One of the pastoral letters. He says to Titus, chapter 1 verse 5, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." Then he goes on. You see, usually what we study from Titus is the qualification of elders, right? And we just jump over this verse about, "I left you there in Crete." Okay? But that's important too. So it seems that Paul went to Crete during this 5-year time frame, and he left Titus there to help organize the church, appoint elders, and so forth. So, where did he
Connect with Titus?
Not sure I can recall that off the top of my head, or that we know. Good question. Anybody knows the answer to that? Pop in. Where did they connect originally? We'll find out. But you can see this is a very active period in Paul's life. I mean, he is not getting out of prison and sitting around watching Jeopardy. Right? He is on the move in this ancient world, going a lot of places. Very active and mobile period. Another place that we know he went was Miletus. Do you remember the name of a place called Miletus? What happened at Miletus in the missionary journeys of Paul? Remember that story? He just stopped there briefly. He was on his way someplace else. Miletus is like on the beach, and he called the elders from Ephesus to come down and meet him before he went back to Jerusalem. Remember, he spoke to the Ephesian elders there and said, "You're never going to see me again." And there's weeping and so forth, all that stuff. Well, if you look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, all right, so now we're up to the last letter Paul wrote, 2 Timothy. And we think when he's writing this, he's in his second imprisonment, okay, in Rome. Chapter 4, verse 20, Paul says, "Erastus remained at Corinth, and I left Trophimus, who was ill, at Miletus." So, again, who's Trophimus? I don't know. A companion of Paul, a co-worker of Paul. But he just makes this note in passing as he finishes this letter to Timothy that he left him at Miletus, which means Paul had been there. He left a sick Trophimus, whoever that is, at Miletus. And Miletus is on the coast of Asia Minor, close to Ephesus. Interesting note about that. At least I think it's interesting. Trophimus apparently is important. It apparently was not God's will to heal everybody all the time. I mean, Paul could heal people, couldn't he? He had healed people. And who's always with Paul? Luke, the physician. But Trophimus, he had to leave sick. So sometimes it's in God's will to heal people, and sometimes it's not part of his purpose. Yeah, we don't know how sick he was. But, yeah, it's interesting. And there's other people that Paul mentions that are very, very ill. Well, why didn't they just bop them on the head or whatever the nuts do today that supposedly heals people? Because that was not the purpose of God all the time. Another place we know Paul went was Troas. Troas is way up in the north of Asia Minor. Remember, that's originally the ancient city of Troy that's so famous in mythology and so forth. Troas was the New Testament period city. And there's this note in 2 Timothy 4 again, so you don't have to turn someplace else, but just back up to verse 13, 2 Timothy 4:13. Paul says to Timothy, "When you come..." Now, where did we say Paul was when he wrote 2 Timothy? In Roman prison. We're going to talk more about that here in a second. Paul writes to Timothy, says, "When you come," he's expecting Timothy to come to Rome, where Paul is locked up. All right? "When you come, Timothy, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas." So that tells you Paul was at Troas during this period. We're just seeking places he went. He's traveling all over, but he left a coat there. "Bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas. Also, what? Also the books or the scrolls, depending on your translation. Mine says the books. And then above all, the parchments." So think about that. Paul is facing a winter in a Roman dungeon. Okay, the second imprisonment in Rome is not the first, like where it was house arrest. He could rent an apartment basically and have a soldier with it. The second imprisonment, he is thrown in like the worst place in Rome. The tradition is it's a place called the Mamertine Prison. Anybody been to Rome? Did you visit the prison? Okay. Yeah, we don't know if that's exact, but it probably looks like that place. It's the kind of place where there's only one source of light and air, and that's the place where they dump the prisoner through. It's a hole. So, serious dungeon kind of place. So he faces a winter in a dungeon in Rome in a time before there were any rights for prisoners. Okay, they hadn't heard the term of, what would we call it today? Humanitarian treatment, that kind of thing. That's not a thing in the ancient world, in Rome especially. You think you might need a coat that he forgot? Because they're not supplying it to him. They don't even give the prisoners food. Some outsiders have to bring them food in the Roman world. They don't give them anything. You throw them in there and they're in there. So he knows he left a coat with Carpus at Troas. Please bring the coat when you come. And the books. Are you surprised that Paul might have books that are important to him? And most of all, the parchments. Well, could be, although parchments is sort of New Testament. The Old Testament was written on papyrus. You know that you're rolled up like this. Parchment is more like our paper. And so it could be unfinished letters that he's writing. It's the kind of writing material he would have used. Maybe it's stuff he's writing, or it's the parchments that he needs to write letters. We don't know, but he seems to think that's really important. Please bring a coat, books, and really don't forget the parchments, he says to Timothy. And in another place he'll say, hurry, please get here by winter. So we start to see like the humanity of Paul. You know, we sort of build him up as a superhero, but here's a guy that's in a dungeon, and he's afraid of freezing to death. He needs his coat and his stuff. And it's going to get worse. Another place that we know he went, probably very late in this period of release, it's a new place we hadn't talked about before. It's Nicopolis, Nicopolis. It won't be on your map, but can you find Italy, the boot of Italy? Okay, the heel of the boot, all right? If you go across the water from the heel of the boot to that next landmass, it's northwestern Greece. It's way up in there. There's a city called Nicopolis. We never hear about it during his missionary journeys, but apparently, for whatever reason, he visited Nicopolis during this release period. The region might be listed there on one of those maps. The region is called Epirus, Epirus, Epirus. But anyway, that's where it is. How do we know he went there? Well, he said he did. Titus chapter 3, verse 12. Titus chapter 3, verse 12. Again, written to Titus. Titus is on Crete. But see, Paul, when he writes these people, he's talking about people all over the empire. All right? Titus 3:12. When I send Artemas or Tychicus to you, do your best to come to me at Nicopolis. Well, Paul would have to be at Nicopolis to ask somebody to come to him at Nicopolis, right? For I have decided to spend the winter there. Titus, please come to me at Nicopolis because I've decided to spend the winter there. But look at the next verse, 13. Ominous note in verse 13. Do your best to speed who? Zenos the who? Send the lawyer. Why do you think Paul is asking for a lawyer? He knows what's about to happen. Speed Zenas the lawyer and Apollos on their way. See that they lack nothing. Well, probably he knew the heat is on and I could use Zenas. And we think, this winter that he's talking about is the one he talks about in another place that he's preparing for. That's why he needs that coat, the whole thing. But it seems like trouble is arising. And a lot of people think that this area, Nicopolis, is maybe where he was arrested the second time. He was arrested and then sent to Rome, put in this dungeon in a very uncomfortable situation to await trial. Yep.
Why was he arrested the second time?
We don't know that. I'm about to surmise a reason, but we don't know. The further we get into this, the less hard fact we're on, but you can sort of put two and two together sometimes. A lot has been going on in Rome during this period. The emperor, do you remember who the emperor is? Nero. It's interesting. In the first part of Nero's reign, he was halfway decent, at least as it related to Christians. But then something happened. It got worse and worse in Rome. Nero and all those around him have gone from bad to worse. And one thing that happens is a gigantic fire breaks out in Rome in 64 AD. It's sort of shrouded in mystery how it happened, but a lot of people think it was Nero and his compatriots' fault. That they had a big party and started a fire and basically burned a lot of Rome down. And people are outraged. And so, what does a politician do when he's in trouble? Find somebody to blame. So they learned it, huh? Absolutely. Blame the most vulnerable minority. And so Nero blames the Christians, and a persecution breaks out, not only from the emperor but from other Romans who, they hear that the Christians did this, and so that kind of thing. It's not hard to imagine that a lot of people start getting arrested, and a lot of awful things happen. Don?
Back in the fire, I've read that it's suspected that they started it to clear out the land for some public works.
Yeah. There's all kinds of ideas about what. It was a big government mess up. And so to cover it up, you blame a group. And you start arresting them and so forth. So, it's not a big leap to think, well, among those you're going to arrest are the known leaders. And so Paul had already spent time in Rome. Remember, he was being very successful in preaching the gospel in Rome. People all around the emperor had learned about Jesus. There were believers now among the Praetorian Guard and so forth, as Paul says. So why not arrest Paul and others? We're speculating there, but that makes a lot of sense. It could have been that way. Again, this second imprisonment is much more severe, and Paul seems to indicate this if you go back to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Again, when he writes this, he's in this second imprisonment. 2 Timothy 2, verse 8, he says, "Remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, the offspring of David, as preached in my gospel, for which I am suffering, bound with chains as a criminal. But the word of God is not bound." That's 2 Timothy 2, verse 9. So he's in chains. And he seems to be talking about it in a much more negative way than he did the first imprisonment. Now, that's not to say that he was totally isolated, because it seems he still has contact with fellow Christians in Rome, because when he's writing this letter to Timothy, the second letter, he sends greetings from these people to Timothy. So if you go over chapter 4 again of 2 Timothy, for instance, verse 21, 2 Timothy 4:21, he says to Timothy, do your best to come before winter. He seems to be anxious to get help there by winter. And then he says, Eubulus sends greetings to you, as do Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brothers. We don't know who any of those people are other than Christians in Rome that Paul had contact with. And he sends in this letter greetings to Timothy from them. But then there seems to be some harder times during this imprisonment because certain people start abandoning Paul as the heat increases. You can imagine if they're arresting Christians, killing Christians in this persecution, it gets dangerous to visit the prison, not just to be seen supporting Paul at all. So some are abandoning him, and some are basically out on mission trips throughout the world. So some of his natural companions are traveling. So again, was Paul important? Yes. But he wasn't the most important thing. What was the most important thing? The gospel was the most important, the mission. Even Paul is not above that. So if you look again in 2 Timothy 4, a couple other verses in this chapter, verse 9, he says again to Timothy, do your best to come to me soon. I mean, don't just skip that verse. He's in a dungeon, all alone. Can you come soon, Timothy? Because, verse 10, Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. We don't know the backstory on that. We just know Demas should have been there for Paul, and he's deserted him. He's left. And apparently for not a good reason, not because of a mission trip. He is in love with the present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Maybe that was just a mission trip. Don't know. Titus to Dalmatia. Probably that was a mission trip. Who is with him? Verse 11. Luke. Loyal Luke. Always seems to be with Paul. Luke alone is with me. Then an interesting note. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Remember Mark? First missionary journey? Abandoned the team. Paul didn't want to take him again on the second trip. And him and Barnabas had a falling out over it. But now, all these years later, bring Mark. He's very useful. They've reconciled at this date. Bring Mark. Skip down to verse 14, if you would. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message. Don't know who he was or that story, but he names him here in this letter. And then verse 19, greet Prisca, that's Priscilla, and Aquila, in the household of Onesiphorus. So again, Paul's writing to Timothy. He's in Ephesus. Priscilla and Aquila have gone to Ephesus. They're not in Rome with Paul anymore. So a lot of people, for one reason or another, are not with Paul while he's in this dungeon. Only Luke stays with him during this period. And Paul's hoping for some others to come, like Mark. Verse 16, same chapter. Let's see if we can get this in. 2 Timothy 4:16. Paul alludes to the first hearing in this second imprisonment. In verse 16, what does he say? At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. His first hearing, in whatever this trial system was, he's all alone. And he writes to Timothy about it. Even Luke, apparently even Luke wasn't there, who was always there. Because Paul says, everybody abandoned me. May it not be charged against him, he says. But the Lord stood by me. Who didn't abandon him? Jesus. The Lord stood by me and strengthened me so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth, which was one way that they killed Christians. Fed them to the lion. Paul is saying, I got through this first one even though all y'all left me. May God not charge you for it. I was there alone. The Lord didn't leave me. And I was able to preach the gospel. So we saw those hearings in Acts where he got to speak and preach the truth. Apparently he got to do it in the court of Nero. And he gets through this first hearing. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. In other words, I didn't die. And the Lord will rescue me from every evil deed, he goes on and says. So he makes it through and got a chance to speak the gospel. But as you read through 2 Timothy, it's clear he doesn't think he's got long. So again in chapter 4, he says in verse 6, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. The time of my departure has come. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. He doesn't think he has long. He doesn't know how long, but not long. And a lot of people think 2 Timothy is written in the last months of 67 AD. So in that winter of 67, that's when he fired off this letter to Timothy, the second one. He spends the rest of the winter, several more months, in this dungeon into the spring of 68 before he faced final sentence. Why do we say 68? Because all the tradition says he died before Nero ended his reign. That he died under the reign of Nero, and Nero's reign ends later in 68. Another thing that, and here we're on tradition grounds, okay, but a lot of people think, and tradition says, that Peter also is arrested in this same period and sent to Rome. And then you go read the letters of Peter, especially 1 Peter, he's talking about persecution all the time. Enduring persecution. Living the right way, so when they make accusations against you, they're lying, that kind of thing. You read 1 Peter, well, he's probably in prison. So they've got Peter, they've got Paul. 1 Peter is probably written about 67, 2 Peter about 68. And when you read 2 Peter, Peter seems to know that he's about to die. Just like when you read 2 Timothy, Paul knows. We won't read the verse now, but 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, he says, the putting off of my body is soon. So just to wrap up real quick, tradition says that sometime in 68, Paul is given final death sentence and he is beheaded. He's killed with the sword at the decree of Nero outside the walls of the city of Rome. And that Peter also is convicted and sentenced, and that he is crucified and requests, when they crucify him, to turn him upside down so he will not die in this exact same way that his Lord did. He didn't feel worthy. Now that's all tradition. Pretty strong tradition, but it's tradition. We don't know that 100%. But remember that Jesus seemed to have predicted the way Peter was going to die in John chapter 21, verses 18 and 19. You can go back and read that.
Doesn't tradition say his wife was
Peter,
killed when his wife was
I'm not familiar with that. That could be. I'd like to know more about that. But that's the last works and writings of Paul. Did that sign-up sheet get around? If you want a copy of that, I'll make you a copy. There was a little notepad going around. If you do want that, find that notepad and get your name on it, I'll get you a copy of this so you can have a little bit more detail. All right? We're going to go on to something else. I don't know what. Do remind the ladies, there is a ladies class starting, is it the first Wednesday? First Wednesday of June. There'll be a ladies class back in the back. So encourage you to take advantage of that. And there will be a class in here as well. So thank you for being a part of this study.